Hello everyone, my name is Caitlin Altamira and I am doing my final presentation on grammar instruction. So first I want to talk a little bit about what is grammar. According to Bastone and Ramirez, grammar is a vast and various phenomenon which vitalizes form, meaning, and use, and it should not be seen as only a set of despotic structures and fixed rules in the language. Bastone and Ramirez also state that grammar is a component of all productive and receptive skills. So in other words, being able to produce and understand language depends on grammar. Alright, so a little bit about the history of grammar instruction. It was actually originally viewed as a vital component to the traditional-based language teaching approaches, and then it transitioned to playing virtually no role in what we now consider communicative-based language approaches. Many linguists have described the history of grammar instruction as being kind of like a battle between form-focused and meaning-focused approaches. Actually, there is considerable controversy even to this day over which approach is best to teaching grammar. Should it be the traditional or the communicative-based approach? In the following slides, I'm going to discuss these approaches in more detail. Alright, so the communicative language teaching approach. This one is quite popular today. It first arose in the 1970s as a response to the traditional language approaches. Advocates for this approach claim that the goal of second language acquisition should be communication more than anything. They believe that memorizing grammar rules is not a valuable component to language acquisition. The communicative language teaching approach is actually based heavily on Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis. So if you remember, we learned about him earlier in the semester. He claimed that explicit grammar instruction is not necessary for language acquisition. He believes that learners will learn the rules as long as they are in a language-rich environment and exposed to comprehensible input. Now, although this may be true for first language acquisition, many researchers have found that it's not always the case for second language acquisition. At least some focus on form or grammar should be part of second language acquisition. So for that reason, form-focused instruction came about. So form-focused instruction, as defined by Ellis, is any planned or incidental instructional activity that is intended to induce language learners to pay attention to linguistic forms. So language forms can be spelling conventions or punctuation or any grammatical structure. Lowen further claims that when students pay attention to linguistic items that arise spontaneously in meaning-focused activities, focus on form takes place. So we can actually separate form-focused instruction into three categories. Long did this in 1998. So he separated them into focus on forms, focus on meaning, and focus on form. So the first, focus on forms, is considered what we now call the traditional approach to grammar. It's exactly what its name says, a focus on just the grammatical forms of the language. And then focus on meaning, again, is exactly what its name says, a focus on just meaning. So there's no attention to grammatical forms in this approach. The focus on meaning approach actually paved the way for a lot of the communicative-based approaches that we use in language teaching today. As kind of like a compromise for focus on forms and focus on meaning, the focus on form approach is kind of like a mix of grammar and meaning. So its goal is to draw learners' attention to specific language forms within the context of communicative and meaning-based activities. So many linguists would agree that this is an effective approach to teaching the grammar of a language. It's important to note that we don't necessarily have to choose one specific form-focused instructional approach to stick to. Instead, we should really choose one that best fits the needs of our students and also the context of our lesson at the time of instruction. So a little more on form-focused instruction. There's quite a bit of research on this approach. It can be related to a lot of second language acquisition theories and linguists as well. So one of them is Schmidt and his 1990 noticing hypothesis. So in his noticing hypothesis, he proposed that nothing is learned until it has been noticed. So according to this theory, second language learners cannot acquire a new grammatical feature solely through comprehensible input. The learner also needs to be made aware of the feature that is trying to be taught. So he claims that form-focused instruction directly draws learners' attention to grammatical features, and therefore it's a necessary component to classroom instruction. Now, it's important to remember that this is for second language acquisition. Also in support of form-focused instruction were researchers Harley and Swain. So based on the results of a study they did with some French immersion programs, Harley and Swain proposed that comprehensible input is not enough to correct learners' errors. It was found that due to the comprehensible input the learners received, they were able to develop good levels of comprehension and fluency. However, their spoken language was not accurate, and it contained errors because they did not receive explicit grammar instruction or corrective feedback. So again, just like Schmidt, they believe that learners need some sort of focus on grammatical features. Then we have Lightbound and Spada, who came around in 1994, and they contributed to the literature on form-focused instruction as well, but in a little bit of a different sense. So they concluded that although form-focused instruction does guarantee noticing, it doesn't really guarantee second language acquisition. They claim that once a language form has been noticed, learners need meaningful practice for it to be acquired. So they also did a study with French-speaking students, and these students were learning adverb placement in English, and one group of students received explicit instruction of the rules and the other students did not. And the results showed that the learners who received the explicit instruction dramatically outperformed those who did not. However, when they were tested 6 weeks later, the progress they made had disappeared. So this regression was due to the fact that they didn't receive enough meaningful practice and adverb exposure after the explicit instruction. So it's important to keep in mind that form-focused instruction in these 3 examples refers to what Long, in the previous slide, would consider a focus on forms, or just focusing on the grammatical component. These studies took place before Long separated form-focused instruction into the 3 categories. So that's why Lightbound and Spada claim that form-focused instruction isn't really enough. When they made that claim, they were referring to the focus on forms or the focus on just grammar not being enough. So now when we talk about form-focused instruction today, we are usually talking about focus on form, which is grammar and meaning. All right, another approach is presentation, practice, and production. This is also referred to as PPP. So this is actually a type of form-focused instruction. And the first step to this approach is to highlight 1 or 2 new forms that you want your students to focus on and just introduce their meaning. And then the next step is controlled practice with these forms. Now this can be done through fill in the blank exercises or writing sentences with the target forms. And then eventually that controlled practice is gradually decreased. And finally, the target forms are used in communicative tasks. All right, then we have consciousness raising activities. Consciousness raising refers to the intentional effort to attract learners' attention to the formal features of the target language. The activities that we do in consciousness raising encourage learners to think about samples of language they are given and to draw their own conclusions about how the language works. So according to a study, consciousness raising activities had a significant impact on the performance of Iranian English as a foreign language learners on a grammar test. So a lot of researchers have found them to be quite effective, and they are still used today. All right, then we have task-based instruction. So the focus of task-based instruction is primarily on completing the task and understanding meaning. There is some opportunity to practice new language forms, but it usually comes at the end because we really want students to focus on meaning before they focus on grammar. This type of instruction usually takes place in pairs or small groups, and it's really great for adult second language learners. A lot of studies have proven that adults need explicit grammar instruction, so this is one way that we can do it, but still place a focus on the meaning. Willis created a task-based learning framework for teachers, and it includes 3 components, which are task, planning, and report. So in his task component, he states that students will work in small groups and the teacher will monitor them from a distance. And then in the planning component, they will prepare a written or oral report in which they explain to the whole class how they accomplished the task and what they discovered. And then finally, the groups will share out. So this can be followed up by a language focus phase in which the students analyze and practice new forms that were in the task they previously completed. So as you can see, that meaning part of the task came first, and then at the end, they went back and looked at the language forms that were in the task. All right, so just to discuss some attitudes towards grammar instruction, in Ganaji's study with Iranian English as a foreign language learners, students reported that their teachers focus primarily on promoting accuracy and that's really important to them. It's also interesting to note that they believe grammar instruction and error correction are one and the same. So to these students, teaching grammar is the same as correcting errors. Now, based on what we've learned from the variety of approaches, grammar instruction is, or in some cases should be, much more than just correcting errors. So depending on where this kind of instruction is taking place in the world, students are going to have very different viewpoints on what grammar is. In another study, learners reported that they had positive attitudes towards consciousness-raising activities, and they considered them to be useful for developing their grammar performance. And that was in the study that I talked about on the consciousness-raising activity slide. All right, so just some final thoughts. When we talk about the best approach to grammar instruction, I'm sure a lot of you are having that question right now. So which one should I use in my classroom? The answer is it's difficult to say whether there is a best approach or not. As you can tell, there are many pros and cons to each approach. But based on the literature and some of the research studies that I read, I would say that second language grammar instruction should involve some type of focus on form. And it's really important that that focus on form instruction is embedded within meaningful practice. So really that last, what Long considered focus on form, which is a mix of grammar and meaning, is just really a great effective approach. But regardless of what you choose, all in all, the approach you take should depend heavily on your students' needs and your goals and their goals for second language communication. So like we do with anything in teaching, all of your decisions should really be based on what your students need. These are my 8 sources that I used. And thank you very much for listening. I hope that you learned something about grammar instruction.